There's a quiet moment most men never notice. A subtle shift that happens long before she pulls away, long before the messages get shorter and the spark fades. And it's not about looks or age or money. It's about a pattern, a set of habits that slowly drain the energy out of attraction until what once felt electric becomes predictable and heavy. And if you miss this moment, you don't just lose her interest. You lose the version of yourself she was once drawn to. Because attraction doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes through small behaviors repeated again and again until she no longer feels that emotional pull that made her choose you in the first place. And the truth is, many older men unknowingly fall into these patterns, believing they are doing the right thing, believing experience alone will carry them, when in reality it's these very habits that quietly turn desire into distance. Because attraction for a younger woman is not built on age or status alone. It's built on energy, emotional presence, and the ability to make her feel alive in your presence. And the moment that energy turns into routine, control, or emotional heaviness, something inside her begins to shut down, even if she can't fully explain why. Because attraction is deeply emotional before it ever becomes physical. And when that emotional current weakens, everything else follows. And one of the most damaging habits is when a man starts replacing curiosity with certainty, when he assumes he already understands her, already knows how she feels, already knows what she needs, because familiarity can quickly turn into complacency, and complacency is the silent killer of desire, especially for someone who craves emotional stimulation and a sense of discovery. Because what initially draws her in is not just who you are, but how you make her feel about herself. And when that sense of discovery fades, when conversations become predictable and interactions lose their edge, she doesn't feel seen anymore. She feels categorized. And once a woman feels like she's been fully figured out, she begins to disengage, not out of cruelty, but because the emotional excitement that once fueled her attraction is no longer present. And alongside that comes another subtle shift. When a man begins to lead with logic instead of emotion, trying to solve everything, trying to explain everything, trying to guide the relationship like a structured plan, rather than an evolving experience. Because while stability is attractive, emotional rigidity is not. And when every conversation becomes practical, when every moment is filtered through control or correction, she starts to feel more like she's being managed than desired. And desire cannot survive in an environment that feels controlled or overly predictable. It needs space, spontaneity, and emotional contrast. It needs moments where she feels something unexpected, something that breaks the pattern and reminds her why she was drawn in to begin with. And when those moments disappear, when everything becomes safe but emotionally flat, she doesn't feel excitement anymore. She feels obligation. And obligation slowly replaces attraction until what remains is just habit. And another habit that quietly erodes connection is when a man begins to seek validation. Instead of creating emotional impact, when he starts needing reassurance, needing confirmation, needing her to prove that she's still interested. Because insecurity, even when subtle, shifts the dynamic in a powerful way. It takes the focus away from shared energy and places it onto emotional dependency. And when she feels that shift, when she senses that you are no longer grounded in your own presence, but are instead looking to her for affirmation, something inside her begins to pull back, Not because she wants to hurt you, but because attraction naturally moves away from neediness and toward confidence, toward a sense of self that doesn't rely on constant reassurance. And when that balance is lost, when the emotional weight starts leaning too heavily in one direction, she begins to feel pressure instead of desire. And pressure is one of the fastest ways to extinguish attraction, because it removes the freedom that makes connection feel exciting in the first place. And then there is the habit of over-explaining, of turning every emotional moment into a discussion, every tension into a debate, because not everything needs to be analyzed or resolved immediately. Sometimes attraction thrives in the unspoken, in the tension, in the mystery of not fully knowing what comes next. And when a man tries to define everything, clarify everything, and eliminate all uncertainty, he also removes the emotional spark that uncertainty creates. Because part of what keeps attraction alive is the feeling that there is still more to discover, more to experience, more to feel. And when everything becomes too clear, too predictable, too structured, that feeling disappears, and with it, a piece of her interest fades as well. And what makes this even more complex is that these habits often come from good intentions, from a desire to be stable, to be reliable, to be someone she can count on. But attraction is not built on intention alone. It's built on emotional experience, on how she feels when she's around you, on whether she feels energized or drained, excited or neutral. And when those feelings begin to shift toward neutrality, toward emotional flatness, that's when interest starts to decline. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, almost invisibly, until one day the connection that once felt effortless now feels like something that requires effort to maintain. And by that point, many men are left confused, wondering what changed, when in reality it wasn't one big mistake. It was a series of small habits repeated over time, each one slightly weakening the emotional connection, until the foundation of attraction could no longer hold its weight. And understanding this is not about blame, it's about awareness. Because once you see these patterns clearly, you begin to realize that attraction is not something you secure once and keep forever. It's something you continuously create through presence, through emotional awareness, through the ability to stay dynamic rather than becoming fixed. And the men who understand this are the ones who maintain that spark, not by trying harder, but by staying emotionally engaged in a way that keeps the connection alive and evolving rather than static and predictable. And this is where everything begins to shift, because once you recognize these habits, you also begin to see how easily they can be replaced with something more powerful. Something that doesn't just maintain attraction, but deepens it over time. Something that transforms the dynamic from routine into something that continues to feel alive, no matter how long you've known each other. And when that shift begins to happen, when you move away from those quiet attraction-killing patterns and start becoming more aware of the emotional experience you create, something changes not just in her, but in you, because the truth is attraction is not a fixed state. It's a living dynamic that responds to energy, and one of the most overlooked habits that slowly drains that energy is when a man starts living too far in the past version of himself, relying on who he used to be instead of who he is becoming, because younger women are often drawn not just to stability, but to movement, to growth, to a sense that the man they are with is still evolving, still expanding, still discovering new layers of himself. And when that sense of growth disappears, when everything about you feels already defined and complete, she doesn't feel inspired. She feels like she's stepping into something that has already peaked. And attraction rarely thrives in environments that feel emotionally finished. It thrives in spaces where there is still momentum, still curiosity, still a sense that something exciting could happen next. And when you stop cultivating that within yourself, when you become too comfortable in your identity, too certain in your patterns, that subtle sense of stagnation begins to show in how you speak, how you respond, how you engage with her. And even if she cannot articulate it, she feels it. Because attraction is often less about what is said and more about what is felt underneath the words. And another powerful habit that quietly weakens connection is when a man confuses emotional availability with emotional intensity, believing that showing more, explaining more, expressing more will automatically deepen the bond, when in reality it can sometimes overwhelm the very dynamic that creates attraction. Because emotional presence is not about constant expression. It's about timing. It's about knowing when to lean in and when to create space. Because space is not distance, it's contrast. And contrast is what keeps emotional experiences from becoming flat. And when there is no contrast, when everything is always available, always expressed, always explained, the emotional rhythm becomes predictable. And predictability slowly erodes desire. Not because stability is unattractive, but because emotional monotony leaves no room for anticipation. And anticipation is one of the most powerful drivers of attraction. It's the feeling that something meaningful is building, something that has not yet fully unfolded. And when that feeling disappears, when everything feels already known, already expressed, already settled, she stops leaning forward emotionally and begins to lean back. And that shift is subtle but critical, because once she starts leaning back, the dynamic begins to reverse. And many men respond to this reversal by trying to close the distance through effort, through more communication, more reassurance, more attention, not realizing that this reaction often accelerates the loss of attraction instead of restoring it. Because what she is pulling away from is not you as a person, but the emotional experience that has become too heavy, too predictable, too one-sided. And when you respond by increasing that same energy, it only reinforces the pattern she is already moving away from. And this is where another key habit reveals itself. The habit of overinvesting too quickly in response to uncertainty. Because when you feel her pulling back, your instinct may be to give more, to prove more, to show more consistency, but attraction does not always respond to more. Sometimes it responds to balance, to restraint, to the ability to remain centered even when the dynamic shifts. And that centeredness creates a sense of emotional strength that is deeply attractive, because it signals that your sense of self is not dependent on her reactions. And when she feels that, when she senses that you are grounded regardless of fluctuations, it reintroduces a form of emotional tension that keeps her engaged. Because tension is not conflict. It's the space between certainty and curiosity. And when that space exists, attraction has room to breathe. And without it, everything becomes emotionally flat. And alongside this comes the habit of losing playfulness, which is one of the most underestimated elements of attraction. Because playfulness is not immaturity. It's emotional flexibility. It's the ability to shift energy, to create moments that feel light, spontaneous, and alive. And when that disappears, when everything becomes serious, structured, or outcome-focused, the connection starts to feel like a responsibility rather than an experience. And younger women especially are highly responsive to this shift because they are often seeking not just stability but emotional stimulation. A sense that being with you adds something vibrant to their life rather than something that feels routine or heavy. And when that vibrancy fades, when interactions lose that spark of unpredictability, she may still care, she may still respect you, but the emotional pull that drives attraction begins to weaken, and what replaces it is a kind of quiet detachment that is difficult to reverse if it goes unnoticed for too long. And then there is the deeper layer, the habit of unintentionally creating a dynamic where she feels more like a role in your life than a person experiencing it with you. Because when routines become rigid and expectations become unspoken rules, she begins to feel like she is fitting into a structure rather than co-creating an experience. And attraction thrives in co-creation, in the feeling that both people are actively shaping the connection in real time. And when that sense disappears, when everything feels predetermined, her emotional investment begins to fade, because she no longer feels the excitement of influence, the excitement of being part of something that is still evolving. And this is where many men misunderstand the nature of long-term attraction, believing that consistency alone is enough, when in reality it is consistency combined with emotional adaptability that keeps the connection alive. Because without adaptability, consistency turns into repetition, and repetition without variation leads to emotional disengagement. And by the time this becomes visible, by the time she starts pulling away more clearly, many of these habits have already been repeated so often that they feel normal, even though they are the very things that have been slowly weakening the connection from within. And recognizing this is not about changing who you are at your core. It's about refining how you express it, how you show up, how you create an emotional experience that remains dynamic rather than static, engaging rather than predictable. And when you begin to shift in this way, when you start paying attention not just to what you do, but to how it feels for her to be around you, you begin to move from simply maintaining a relationship to actively shaping attraction in a way that feels natural, effortless, and deeply compelling. And this is where the real transformation begins, not in grand gestures or dramatic changes, but in the subtle recalibration of habits that either drain or amplify the emotional energy between you. And once you start to see these patterns clearly, you realize that attraction is less about external factors and more about the internal state you bring into every interaction, because that state influences everything, from the way you speak to the way you listen, from the way you respond to the way you create space. And when that internal state is grounded, dynamic, and emotionally aware, it naturally creates an experience that keeps her engaged, without forcing anything, without chasing anything, without needing constant validation. And that is the point where attraction stops feeling fragile and starts becoming something that sustains itself through the quality of the connection you create. And when you reach that point, when you begin to understand that attraction is something you generate through presence, rather than something you secure through effort, everything about the dynamic starts to feel different, lighter yet deeper at the same time, because you are no longer reacting to her behavior. You are shaping the emotional tone of the connection through how you show up. And this is where the final and perhaps most important shift happens, the release of control. Because one of the most subtle but destructive habits older men fall into is the need to manage outcomes, to guide the relationship towards certainty, to ensure things stay on track, to prevent loss before it happens. But attraction does not respond to control. It responds to authenticity, to emotional freedom, to the sense that what is happening between two people is unfolding naturally rather than being directed or contained. And when a woman feels that freedom, when she senses that she is not being managed or subtly steered, she becomes more present, more expressive, more invested, because the connection no longer feels like something she has to live up to. It feels like something she gets to experience, and that shift alone can reignite a level of attraction that many men believe is lost forever once it fades. Because what often disappears is not attraction itself, but the conditions that allow it to exist. And when those conditions are restored, when the dynamic becomes open again, fluid again, emotionally engaging again, the spark has space to return. But this requires a level of awareness that goes beyond surface behaviors. It requires you to recognize when you are acting matok fear rather than confidence, when your actions are driven by the need to secure rather than the desire to experience, because those two mindsets create completely different emotional environments. One feels tight, controlled, and heavy, while the other feels expansive, natural, and alive. And people are always drawn toward what feels alive, especially in intimate relationships, where emotional energy is everything. And this is where the idea of emotional leadership becomes essential. Not leadership in the sense of dominance or authority, but in the sense of setting the tone, creating an atmosphere where both people feel something real, something engaging, something that goes beyond routine interaction. And emotional leadership means being willing to allow moments to breathe, to not rush to fill every silence, to not over-explain every feeling, to not chase reassurance when uncertainty appears, but instead to remain grounded, present, and open, because that openness invites her to step forward rather than pulling back. And when she steps forward emotionally, when she begins to invest again without feeling pressure, the connection starts to rebuild itself organically, without force, without strategy, just through the natural response to a healthier dynamic. And this is also where physical intimacy becomes more than just a physical act. It becomes an extension of the emotional energy between you. Because when the emotional connection is alive, when there is tension, curiosity, and presence, physical intimacy feels deeper, more engaging, more meaningful. But when the emotional layer is flat, when it is filled with routine, control, or subtle neediness, that same physical interaction loses its intensity. It becomes mechanical rather than magnetic. And many men try to fix this at the physical level, without realizing that the root cause is emotional. Because desire is not something you can force through technique. It is something that emerges from the quality of connection that exists beneath the surface. And when that quality improves, when the emotional dynamic becomes more balanced, more alive, more responsive, everything else naturally follows. And this brings everything back to a simple but powerful truth. Attraction is not maintained by doing more. It is maintained by doing differently. By becoming aware of the habits that quietly drain the connection and replacing them with a presence that feels engaging rather than predictable. confident rather than dependent, expressive yet not overwhelming, consistent yet not repetitive. And when you embody that balance, when you stop trying to control outcomes and start focusing on creating an experience that feels alive in the moment, you remove the pressure that suffocates attraction and replace it with something far more sustainable, something that evolves rather than fades. And in that space, she does not feel the need to pull away, because there is nothing pushing her. There is only something drawing her in naturally, something that makes her want to stay engaged, to keep exploring, to keep experiencing what the connection has to offer. And that is ultimately what keeps attraction alive over time. Not perfection, not constant effort, but the ability to remain emotionally present, adaptable, and aware of how your energy shapes the dynamic between you. Because when you understand that, when you truly internalize it, you stop chasing attraction and start becoming the kind of man who naturally creates it. And that is the moment where everything changes, not just in how women respond to you, but in how you experience relationships as a whole. Because instead of feeling like something you have to maintain, it becomes something you get to experience fully, deeply, and without the constant fear of losing it. And that is what transforms not just attraction, but the entire connection into something that feels real, lasting, and genuinely fulfilling from both sides.